So now we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. First, we have two cerebral hemispheres, a right and left, separated by an interhemispheric fissure, shown here, that separates the two hemispheres. Notice that we're looking at the left hemisphere from the side. We call it the lateral view. Next, we can look at the cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter, which is just collections of cell bodies covering each cerebral hemisphere. And notice that there's lots of folds, which we call gyri or gyrus singular, and grooves or sulci or sulcus to be singular. And notice I'm going to highlight those here in this cartoon. Notice all those grooves and folds. Now let's take a look at lobes. And we have now stripped away all the sulci and gyri, and we're going to look at the frontal lobe, and that's indicated here on the anterior part of the brain. We have the parietal lobe, which is located behind the frontal lobe posteriorly. We have the temporal lobe located right about here. And then we have the occipital lobe, which is located in the back side of the brain, right there. So now let's label that interhemispheric fissure that separated the two hemispheres right here. We also have a central sulcus that separates the frontal and parietal lobe, and we have a lateral fissure that separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. Now, if we look at the frontal lobe, there's the primary motor cortex, which we can draw in right there, located in the posterior frontal lobe, and that's where we have our upper motor neuron cell bodies for the somatic motor system. We have the frontal eye fields that are involved in voluntary horizontal eye movements. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is right about here. There's lots of parts. It's involved in executive functioning. And then we can add the Broca's area, which is the language output area, located in the left side, usually right about there. And then finally, we can put in the olfactory bulb and tract, which is on the underside of the frontal lobe on each side. We can label that right there. Now, if we look at the parietal lobe, this has the primary somatosensory cortex located right there, where all your somatosensory information comes in. And then we also can look at the temporal lobe, which has the primary auditory cortex, which all your auditory information comes in. It's located right about there. We can also add Wernicke's area, which is the language comprehension area, which is usually on the left side, located right about there in the temporal lobe. Notice that we don't have the hippocampus shown, which is extremely important for memory. That's in the medial temporal lobe on both sides. Finally, we have the primary visual cortex. That's the important part of the occipital lobe, where your vision information comes in from your eyes. Knowing these functions in these lobes is really important when you're figuring out what you're going to get with certain lesions of the brain. So lesions of the frontal lobe, as you can see, can cause a lot of different types of dysfunction, and you can also predict as well different lesions in the other lobes and the types of deficits that you would get.